Carl Jung's warning: addiction isn't what you think it is, you think you know what addiction is. We all do. It's the person who can't stop drinking, the one who loses their job because they're gambling, the kid who plays video games for 14 hours a day, the person who can't put their phone down. It's about substances, behaviors, habits, repetition, loss of control. That's what we've been told. But what if we're wrong? What if addiction isn't just about what we do too much of, but about what we're lacking at the deepest level of our soul? Carl Jung, one of the most radical thinkers of the 20th century, believed that addiction wasn't a disease. He believed it was a spiritual problem. And that's where everything changes. In one of the most famous letters Jung ever wrote, he responded to a man named Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. Jung said something shocking. You see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience, as well as for the most depraving poison. He went on to say that the alcoholic's craving for alcohol was, at its core, a spiritual thirst, a hunger for wholeness, for transcendence, for meaning. And this wasn't Jung being poetic. He meant it literally. Addiction, to him, wasn't about the substance. It was about the void beneath it, a void that modern life has made almost impossible to face. Now stop for a second and ask yourself, what are you addicted to? Not just in the obvious way. Think deeper. What do you turn to when life feels empty? When the silence is too loud? When your sense of self starts to dissolve? For some, it's alcohol. For others, it's achievement. For others, it's social media, those little dopamine hits that distract us from the terrifying question beneath it all. Who am I when I'm not consuming something? Jung believed that every person carries within them a hidden world of vast unconscious made of symbols, fears, archetypes, forgotten memories, and unlived potential. And when we deny its existence, it doesn't disappear. It fights back. It leaks out. It shows up in our compulsions, in our obsessions, in our addictions. We become enslaved not to the thing itself, but to the shadow it conceals. And this is where addiction becomes more than a behavioral pattern. It becomes a philosophical crisis.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
You see, addiction isn't always about excess. Sometimes it's about avoidance. It's the constant need to not be here, to not be present, to not feel, to not remember. And if we look around, we see it everywhere. People glued to screens, not because they love what they're watching, but because they can't bear to be alone with their thoughts. People chasing likes, money, sex, validation, not because they're greedy, but because they're hollow. Because somewhere along the way, they lost touch with something sacred. And in that absence, addiction took root. Jung warned us, if we don't integrate the unconscious, if we don't face our own inner darkness, it will rule us from the shadows. The addict, then, is not weak. They are someone whose psyche has become fragmented. Someone whose soul has been split between the person they show to the world and the person they've buried inside. And the drug, or the behavior, or the distraction that's just the bridge between the unbearable present and the divine they've forgotten. Think about that. What if your addiction, whatever form it takes, isn't a flaw, but a message? A cry from some deeper part of you begging for attention? What if the compulsions you hate are actually clues pointing to something you've avoided for years? Maybe your scrolling isn't laziness. Maybe it's loneliness. Maybe your perfectionism isn't ambition. Maybe it's fear of being unloved. Maybe your obsession with success isn't drive. Maybe it's a desperate attempt to matter. And what if the only way out isn't to stop the behavior, but to listen to what it's trying to say? Jung believed that healing doesn't come from suppression. It comes from integration. From facing the parts of ourselves we've disowned. From diving into the unconscious and bringing its contents into the light. And that's terrifying, because it's easier to binge, to scroll, to drink, to work, to escape, than it is to sit with your pain. But in that pain is your truth. And Jung knew that until you face it, you will always be addicted to something, because the addiction isn't the problem. It's the symptom. It's the mask. So here's the question you have to ask yourself, and I mean really ask it: what part of yourself have you been running from? What memory? What loss? What shame? What dream? What truth? Can you sit in the silence long enough to hear it? Can you be still long enough to feel it? Or will you reach for the next dopamine hit, the next distraction, the next numbing agent to push it all back down? This is Jung's warning. And it's not just about drugs or alcohol or gambling. It's about the human condition, about the way we all, in our own way, try to avoid being fully alive. Because life, when faced honestly, is overwhelming. But Jung didn't leave us in despair. He also believed in the possibility of transformation, that the same force which leads us into addiction can also lead us out if we're willing to confront what lies beneath. So the next time you feel the urge to escape, to numb, to distract, don't just fight the urge. Ask it why it exists. Ask what it's pointing to. Ask what it's trying to protect you from. Because addiction isn't what you think it is. It's not the thing you're doing. It's the part of you you've forgotten how to hear. The shadow you refuse to face, why repressing pain creates lifelong addiction. Addiction isn't born in a vacuum. It's born in a split, a fracture between who you are and who you pretend to be. Between what you feel and what you allow yourself to express. Between the conscious self, the part you show to the world, and the unconscious self, the part you bury, deny, and exile. Carl Jung called this the shadow. And he warned us, the more we repress it, the more it controls us from behind the curtain. Not directly, not obviously, but through patterns, compulsions, and behaviors we can't stop. And this is the part most people miss. Addiction isn't just a chemical dependency. It's a psychic response to disconnection from the self. Think about it. How many of us were taught to feel our emotions fully? To grieve without shame? To admit weakness without judgment? Most of us were raised in systems, families, schools, cultures where vulnerability was punished, where pain was pathologized, where anger was dangerous, where sadness was inconvenient. So we learned to hide, to suppress, to become what others needed us to be. And in doing so, we exiled entire parts of ourselves. But those parts didn't disappear. They became the shadow. And the shadow doesn't go quietly. Jung said it best. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Addiction is how the shadow whispers. It's how the pain we haven't processed finds a way to speak. And it always speaks in metaphor. The alcoholic doesn't just crave a drink, they crave relief. Forgetting. A break from the unbearable weight of being. The workaholic doesn't just love productivity, they're terrified of stillness, where all the repressed pain might rise to the surface. The social media addict doesn't just want entertainment, they crave validation, belonging, a momentary escape from the quiet ache of disconnection. So when we say someone is addicted, we're not just talking about a substance or a behavior. We're talking about a relationship with pain, with emptiness, with a self that has been denied expression. And the more we refuse to face that self, the more addicted we become. Not out of weakness, but out of survival. Because when your shadow is too terrifying to face directly, you'll do anything to keep it buried. But here's the paradox. The more you repress your shadow, the more powerful it becomes. You might think you're in control, that you've got your life together. But the shadow is patient. It waits. And when you're tired, when you're vulnerable, when something cracks the thin surface of your persona, it rushes in. That's why people relapse after years of sobriety. Why successful, high-functioning people suddenly self-destruct. It's not random. It's the return of what has been denied. And the longer it's been buried, the more violently it emerges. Now ask yourself, what part of you have you been pretending doesn't exist? What pain keeps showing up in different forms, different addictions, different breakdowns, because you haven't had the courage to face it directly? Jung believed that this confrontation with the shadow wasn't just necessary, it was sacred. He called it the process of individuation, becoming whole by integrating what we've rejected. Not by becoming perfect, but by becoming real. Real healing, then, isn't about cutting out the addiction. It's about cutting into the truth that the addiction was hiding. And that truth is always emotional. It's the childhood wound that never healed, the abandonment you never grieved, the shame that still lives in your nervous system, the love you were never shown, the voice you were never allowed to use. Until you face these things, you will always be addicted to something, because addiction isn't the disease, it's the symptom. The real disease is disconnection from the self. And that's where true courage lies, not in resisting the urge, but in listening to it, in asking, what is this trying to protect me from? What am I afraid I'll feel if I stop distracting myself? Because beneath every addiction is a wound. And beneath every wound is a truth. And the moment you stop running from that truth, even if it breaks you, is the moment you begin to become whole again. Carl Jung didn't believe you could heal through willpower alone. He believed you had to descend into the darkness, into the confusion, into the parts of yourself you fear the most. He believed that the shadow, once faced, becomes a source of power. Not because it disappears, but because it becomes integrated. And once that happens, you no longer need to be addicted, because you're no longer running. You're no longer hiding. You're no longer afraid of yourself. So here's the question you have to live with, not just for today, but for the rest of your life. What am I avoiding by staying addicted? And what would it mean to stop running and start listening instead? Becoming whole. Why real healing isn't about quitting, it's about integration. Most people think healing means stopping. Stopping the drinking. Stopping the scrolling. Stopping the overeating. Stopping the behaviors that have spiraled out of control. In other words, they think healing is quitting. But Carl Jung would have told you something radical, something that turns our modern understanding of addiction completely upside down. Healing isn't about quitting, it's about integrating. Because when you try to cut something out of your life without understanding why it's there, you don't remove it, you just bury it deeper. And when you bury it, it gains power. It becomes, let's be honest, quitting is easier than integrating. Quitting is binary. And this isn't just abstract philosophy. It's practical. For example, instead of just trying to stop scrolling mindlessly, you ask, what am I avoiding by doing this? Maybe you're lonely. Maybe you're overwhelmed. Maybe you're terrified of your own thoughts. Now you're not just quitting the habit, you're understanding it. You're integrating the emotion it was masking. And once you do that, you don't need as much willpower, because the need starts to dissolve. The behavior loses its grip, not through force but through awareness. This is why Jung's work is so powerful. He doesn't ask us to become better versions of ourselves. He asks us to become whole, not perfect. Whole. That means ugly and beautiful, strong and broken, addicted. So here's the question I want you to sit with. What part of yourself have you been trying to quit when what it really needs is to be understood? What would happen if, instead of fighting that part, you invited it in, listened to its story, and gave it a seat at the table? Because the truth is, you will never be free from something you hate. You will only be free from it when you understand it. And that's the path Jung laid out for us, not the path of resistance, but the path of integration, the path that leads not to the illusion of perfection, but to the reality of wholeness. The sacred path of the wounded. Why your pain is the doorway to purpose. Carl Jung didn't just study the psyche, he walked into it. He dared to explore the darkest corners of the human soul and came back with something most people spend their entire lives avoiding. The understanding that your wound is not your weakness, it's your teacher. And this is the final, and maybe most powerful, truth about addiction. The thing you've been running from, the grief, the trauma, the emptiness, the shame, isn't the enemy. It's the gatekeeper. It's the test life gave you, not to destroy you, but to awaken you. Because in Jung's world, the wound isn't something to be healed and forgotten. It's something to be honored. It's the initiation into who you were always meant to become. Think about the story of the addict. Not the version we see in headlines or in judgmental whispers, but the real story. This is the archetype of the wounded healer, a concept Jung drew from mythology and psychology alike. The idea is simple but profound. Your deepest wound becomes your greatest gift, but only if you face it. Only if you walk through it. Only if you stop numbing it and start listening to what it's trying to show you. That's the difference between someone who remains trapped in addiction for life and someone who rises from it with wisdom. Not strength, not discipline, wisdom. The kind that only comes from descent into the self. And if you've ever been addicted to anything at all, you know that descent. You know what it means to lose control, to feel small, to feel broken. But what if that wasn't the end of the story? What if that was the beginning? Because here's the truth. So many people spend their lives searching for purpose like it's some hidden treasure. But purpose isn't something you find by looking outward. It's something you uncover by looking inward. Into the pain, into the failures, into the moments you thought would break you. Because those moments are not random. They are the curriculum of your soul, the unique path you were given, not as punishment, but as preparation. And if you ignore that path, you may live a comfortable life, but you will never live a meaningful one. Jung would tell you, don't run from the wound. Don't try to medicate it away. Don't try to achieve your way around it. Walk into it, dialogue with it. Let it guide you to the parts of yourself you've forgotten. And then, when you've done that, when you've descended and survived, you rise. Not as someone who has quit addiction, but as someone who has transformed it. So here's the final question. What if your addiction isn't the detour, it's the path? What if your pain is not the thing that disqualifies you from your purpose, but the very thing that prepares you for it? What if the wound is the seed? Because addiction isn't what you think it is. And neither are you. You're not broken. You're becoming.